Oh, we're sharing now. That's great. I'll get that across. One sec.
Okay,
yes,
we're good. We're good to go.
Yes, you're good to go.
Okay, thanks so much. Yes, and thanks for the invitation to this conference. It's very early in the morning here, but I'll to remain coherent. The first thing I just wanted to say regarding the legacy of the Berlin Conference and the scramble in general is that what we are discussing are crimes, essentially. And I've just returned from the Algiers conference, where one of the main considerations was the question of not just the crimes of colonialism, but colonialism as a crime in itself, a crime against humanity. And so this is the, we can say, trajectory which the African Union and others are on. And so everything that we're discussing, everything this conference is discussing, we could see in terms of the crimes against humanity. And what I intend to do today is just to speak about some of these crimes, we can say, some of the legacy of the scramble itself, or the first scramble, I should say, as far as Africa is concerned. And it's, I guess, important to say at the outset that these crimes were carried out by violent means. So when we're talking about the scramble and the partition of Africa, of which the Berlin Conference was a part, I'm sure, as you heard yesterday, was a means by which the big powers, we could say the imperialist system of states which existed at that time, the late 19th century, the means by which those big powers tried to create essentially the rules of scramble, the rules of their contention. In other words, that the disputes between the big powers should be kept to a minimum by various guidelines and rules which were drawn up at the Berlin Conference and subsequently. But those rules were all about the partition of the African continent, what the King of Belgium called the magnificent African cake, as you can see illustrated here. And that scramble, that contention, that division and partition of the continent was carried out on the ground by violent means. And in fact, the Berlin Conference, in a sense, speeded up those violent confrontations which took place on the continent itself. It's also important to say that this partition, this invasion of the African continent, was always resisted. It wasn't as if the big European powers just landed and divided things up between themselves. I don't have time to go into all the acts of resistance that took place across the continent, but probably the most famous are those in the Horn of Africa, and particularly at the famous Battle of Adwa that we can see illustrated here in 1896, when the armies of the Ethiopian Empire defeated those of Italy. And this is perhaps the most famous resistance or act of resistance, the most famous battle in that history. But there were many across the continent. And for that reason, the complete division and partition of the continent took a very, very long time after Berlin. It wasn't completed in some cases until the 1920s. Okay, so what was the consequence then of Berlin and the scramble? Well, we can immediately go to
recording in progress.
We can immediately go to what is today Democratic Republic of the Congo, which as a consequence of the Berlin Conference was essentially the private empire of the King of Belgium, curiously named the Congo Free State. And as is probably well known, this is one of the first genocides that took place as a result of the Berlin Conference and the scramble at the end of the 19th century. So from 1885 to about 1908, 1909, Leopold of Belgium and his associates, ran amok, really, we could say, in the Congo. And it's quite important to think about who these associates were. They included people like J.P. Morgan, John Rockefeller, Guggenheim, big American capitalists, we could call them. I think that's what they were, who plundered the Congo region for rubber and for ivory in particular, in ways, I mean, to say they were crimes against humanity is you could say, to understate the reign of terror that took place in that region. It resulted in millions of deaths. The figures are contested, perhaps as many as 10 million. Some people say half the population of the Congo were lost during that period, as well as the amputations of limbs of men, women, and children. And to such a degree that it became an international scandal. The Belgian government was forced to step in and to impose its reign, its rule over that part of Africa for the next, whatever it was, nearly 60 years. So this is one of the first major crimes, perhaps one of the most notorious of those crimes carried out, and is part of the legacy of that conference in Berlin, which much of its discussions actually centered on what was going to happen to the Congo region. Then we can turn to what is today Namibia. At that time, before the First World War, German Southwest Africa, where another major crime was committed, and that's the genocide of the Nama and Herero that you can see pictured here. Again, it's estimated that about 80% of the Herero people, maybe 50% of the Nama, were wiped out in a policy of essentially extermination, carried out by a variety of means that I won't go into now. Of course, in recent years, it's been acknowledged as a genocide. The German government is now committed to paying reparations, I think, of some $1 billion or whatever it is exactly that they have agreed to pay over a lengthy period of time. But it's another illustration of the nature of the imposition of colonial rule, what this legacy was in human terms was quite enormous. Then I'm just a third illustration. This is just an example because colonial rule was essentially a means for the extraction of wealth from the African continent, although it was justified in various terms, civilizing mission, white man's burden, etc., in various ways, which are important to reflect on because similar justifications for intervention in the continent and elsewhere are given today by the big powers. But this particular image relates to Sao Tome and Principe, which was a Portuguese colony and actually became the world's largest producer of cocoa. And between the 1880s and 1908 or 1909, something like that, it became an area where slavery was reintroduced under another name. And slave labor was imported from Portugal's other colonies, from Angola, from Mozambique, from Cape Verde, into Sao Tome and Principe in order to produce cocoa for the big chocolate manufacturers, including Cadbury, Rowntree, and many, many others that I won't name now. Death rates were estimated to be as high as 20% of men, women, and children per year during that period until there was another international scandal. And some of the big, especially the big British chocolate manufacturers, transferred their activities to the Gold Coast, what is today Ghana. But this is another example not only of slave labor that was utilized during colonial rule. Sometimes it's designated forced labor, which amounts to the same kind of thing. And forced labor or slave labor was widely used during the colonial period. Many of the infrastructural projects, if we can call them that, the construction of roads, the construction of railways, the construction of ports, and so on, used forced labor of various kinds, those who were imprisoned for various acts of resistance. So I think it's just important to recognize the nature of colonial rule. And I could have given many other examples. I don't have time to give all the examples, but hopefully these will suffice. And then another significant legacy of this period are, of course, the borders which were constructed. And you can see here a representation of Africa, or the division of Africa, excuse me, on the eve of the First World War, the division of the continent between the major powers, particularly Britain and France, but also including Germany, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and so on, which was already underway at that time. And the entire continent, with the exception of Ethiopia in the east and Liberia in the west, although Liberia is a rather strange case because it was essentially a US colony, we can say, dominated by the Firestone Rubber Company. But with those two exceptions, the entire continent divided between the major imperialist powers. And I'll say more about borders a little bit later. Okay, then the next legacy I thought it important to mention because it also constitutes another crime of the colonial powers or of colonialism is the fact that the scramble, the contention between the big powers for spheres of influence, for markets, for territory, for resources, culminated not in the way that had been intended by the Berlin Conference, but in the way that contention between the big powers always resulted in what contention between the big powers always results in, and that is war. And that brings us to 1914 and the First World War, the first shots of which, it could be said, were fired in Africa, and the last shots of which were fired in Africa. And so it plunged the African continent unwillingly into that global conflict. And I have some statistics here. It's calculated that about 2 million Africans participated in the First World War. That's in military capacity, civilian capacity, particularly as porters or carriers. And then if we look at the deaths from that war, again, somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million people. And again, these are deaths not just in combat, but mainly deaths resulting from the flu epidemic, which followed the war, from famine, which resulted from the inability of people to farm during the war, as well as other deaths. And so it's, again, a tremendous loss to the continent, and one that was resisted. Again, I don't have time to go into all the resistors to this imposition. I guess the most famous is John Chilembwe in Nyasaland, as was at that time, who led a rebellion against the imposition of conscription the fact that Africans were being forced into war and was assassinated, or executed rather, by the British colonial authorities for that heroic act. So the scramble culminated in that new war of redivision. So following the war, the redivision took place on the ground, we can say. And one can illustrate it here in West Africa as an example, that those who lost the war lost their colonies. And here we can see in particular how Germany's colonies were divided between Britain and France in West Africa. I think it's important to say that the legacy of that division, particularly in Cameroon, is still with us. But of course, it wasn't just in West Africa that Africa was redivided by the victors of that war. Again, if we look at a map of the whole, all of these, but you can see that Tanganyika in the east became the British colony. Southwest Africa in the south was basically given to South Africa. These were so-called mandates. I'm not quite sure what the idea of who mandated the League of Nations to divide up Africa in this way. But it's a very good illustration of division, of the fact that the contention between the big powers was about division. The war was about division. And once the war had ended, the redivision took place throughout the continent. Of course, this map illustrates that there's other types of contention going on within the continent during this period, which is also a legacy of the war, of colonialism, and of the entire scramble at that time for African land, resources, labor, and so on. So if we think about colonialism as a whole, again, I don't have time to go into all the consequences of it, but again, just to re-emphasize that it was essentially a system of wealth extraction for the benefit of the colonial powers, whoever or wherever they might be. It was not something carried out for the benefit of Africans, just in case anyone's any doubts about that. And for that reason, as I said earlier, it's being represented as a crime for which reparation needs to be made. Of course, that crime hasn't ended, and I'll go on to say a little bit more about that in a moment. Of course, once again, there were many acts of resistance throughout the colonial period, the period after the First World War, during the 1930s, 1940s, which one doesn't have time to go into now, but I thought as it's the 80th anniversary, I would just mention the Manchester Pan-African Congress of 1945, also because the 9th Pan-African Congress in Lomé ended yesterday. Again, the Manchester Pan-African Congress, we can say, was a reflection of the resistance and opposition to colonialism during this period. It took place just after the Second World War, in which Africa had also been involved. And leaving aside the rather interesting slogans, which you can see displayed here, I suppose the key features of this Congress was the demand for the end to colonial rule, the threat, if we can call it that if it wasn't ended rapidly, it would be ended by force, that Africans would end it by force, and particularly by the organization of the masses of the people, workers, farmers, and so on. But also, particularly important, the rejection of the key impositions of colonialism, the rejection of colonial borders, the rejection of alien political institutions, as they were called, and the rejection of the capital-centered system. And these were the three key considerations of that Manchester Congress. And 80 years later, we can say that Africa is still dealing with these three major problems, as well as many other problems too. Now we move to one of the most important legacies of this whole period, which was the struggle to end colonialism in Africa. And again, I think it's important to emphasize that this was a struggle carried out in different ways, by diplomatic means, by political means, by the organization of the masses of the people, and by armed struggle, and at a tremendous cost. And as I've just returned from Algeria, it's not inappropriate to mention the struggle that took place in Algeria from 1954 onwards, in which 1.5 million people lost their lives. And of course, if we look at the whole anti-colonial struggle going, I'm not sure what the estimate is of how many lives were lost, but these are also part of the criminality of colonialism, that it created this situation in the continent where so many had to fight just for the right to determine their own futures. So formal colonial rule came to an end in different times. The 1960s, obviously a key decade, but throughout a lengthy period, going back from the 1920s and carrying on till today, because there are still parts of Africa which have not been decolonized in that formal sense. I suppose the most significant of which would be the Western Sahara, which is still effectively being colonized, although this time not by a European power. So that period of what is referred to as decolonization, I always think important to mention that decolonization was the act of the colonial power rather than the act of Africans. And it's important to reflect on that, that despite the struggles that took place in Algeria, in Kenya, in various other places, decolonization very often was the act carried out by the colonial power. In other words, the colonial power retained some influence, some political, military, and economic control over exactly what happened in what were to become its former colonies. And I'll go on to say a little bit more about that now. Now, one of the first issues, just going back to the map again, if one looks at Africa decolonized, as it were, or Africa at the time of independence, we can see that generally speaking, the colonial boundaries were maintained and are still maintained. And the question naturally arises why that should be the case. And there were a number of discussions about this in the early period, the 1960s in particular. And I just wanted to share the declaration of, it should actually be 1964. That's a mistake there, an error there. The Cairo Declaration in 1964. So this was the OAU summit of that year. And you can see that the explanation given for the decision that was reached, in other words, that the borders would be respected. The main consideration was that the main consideration at that time was the need for African unity. And if you look at the conference that took place at that time, the main items on the agenda for that conference were the situation in South Africa, in Namibia, in what were the Portuguese colonies, and so on. And so the main consideration was to avoid inter-African disputes about borders. Of course, there had been discussions before that. Even at the founding of the Organization of African Unity in 1963, there were some discussions. I suppose Nkrumah was the person who raised the issue of borders, not from the point of view of resolving border disputes, but from the perspective of establishing United States of Africa, where borders would be less of an issue. So that project of Nkrumah and others was not accepted. And of course, there are many reasons why that was the case, and differences between African states that existed during that period, as well as the influence of the big powers. But this I present just to explain the decision that was taken at that time and has been reaffirmed in the period since then. So what was then the legacy of this entire period? And I think we could sum it up by saying that what emerged colonial rule was a period of new forms of colonialism, which Nkrumah, Fanon, and others spoke about, and which became referred to as neocolonialism. And one of the main features of neocolonialism is the fact that the difficulty that Africa had of moving away from the political system, the economic system, which had been established during the period since the Berlin Conference and even before the Berlin Conference. In other words, Africa's relationship with Europe in particular was one of dependency and one essentially of underdevelopment. That is to say, Africa's wealth was still being consumed or utilized, not in Africa, but elsewhere. And so to give just some examples of that, there are many, many examples which exist to this day. And this particular graphic is about debt. I'm not sure how well people will be able to read that, but this gives an illustration of some of those countries which are paying debts. Perhaps the next slide will make it a little bit clearer. Debt has been referred to as a new form of financial colonialism. And it's important to stress that many of the debts which African countries have today existed from or were handed over from the colonial period. I've just given the example of Democratic Republic of Congo, which inherited a debt of $311 million, going back even to the time of the Congo Free State. And 120 million of that was soon transferred to the World Bank. And then the position of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund is a whole other issue, which I'm not going to go into now. But just to give the kind of bald facts of the debt situation today. So as you can see, Africa's public debt has doubled since 2010. By the end of 2024, it's about 2 trillion, and debt servicing about 1.6 billion a year. It's also the case that even on debt servicing, basically interest payments on debt, African countries are estimated to pay about 80 billion more in what are called risk premium. In other words, it costs African countries more to borrow. And then the last part of that, the 60% of Africans live in countries that spend more on debt servicing than on health and education. So in other words, that dependency, that indebtedness, which existed even during the colonial period, because even that capital that was used to build roads, railways, and so on and so forth was financed from the people of Africa and so on, and by the people of Africa going into debt, or debt being taken out, as it were, which rested on their backs and still rests on the backs of Africans. So that is one way in which this legacy has been continued. Oh, what happened there? Okay, the second is the whole question of, we could say, the scramble for Africa's resources. And this is just a very graphic example, not very precise, but an example of the struggle for those resources. We can break it down more precisely. In 2016, which is what, just nearly 10 years ago, War on Want produced a whole report on new colonialism, as they called it, in Africa, just looking at 101 companies on the stock exchange and the wealth which was controlled by these companies. And they named some of the companies, which I haven't done here. But you can see that just these 101 companies controlled most of Africa's resources in oil, gas, gold, diamonds, copper, cobalt, silver, and coal. Land holding concessions, which about a third of them had. And these are some examples of the amount of control that these companies had. These figures are from 10 years ago. So I think everybody can see that for themselves. These companies, as I say, I haven't named them, but they're companies like Anglo American would be one example. And then that brings us to the question of the new scramble. And so this contention for African resources, African minerals, African land, African labor, and African markets, which are all so very, very important, have culminated in what many people refer to as the new scramble for Africa. That is to say, the contention between the big powers for these resources. And today, it's not just the old big powers. It's not just Britain, France, the US, but today there are new powers involved: China, Turkey, UAE, and others that are contending for these resources. And I've just named 3 places where this contention is particularly acute, and maybe take DR Congo first because the evidence is so overwhelming there. And this is even going back to the 1990s, where you'll remember the first 2 Congo wars, as they're often referred to, because we have a UN investigation into those wars from 1996 to 2001, and most of this information is available online. The point being that between the wars that were fought in DR Congo, and which involved, I think, a dozen other African countries, stood the big multinational companies. Big multinational companies in Britain, in France, in Belgium, the US, and other countries. And so one can find this new scramble taking place. It's a scramble that takes place in a military way, very often again at the expense of Africans. But behind it are the interests of the big multinationals, the big banks, and so on. Then Libya, well, the intervention in Libya, we could say, is also part of that scramble. Okay, it's NATO intervention. Again, justified by one can say the so-called right to protect, which is a meaningless phrase in international law, and carried out by the military of Britain, France, the US, and so on, and others, again in the geopolitical interests as well as the economic interests of those that the big powers represent, and with consequences not just for Libya, but the whole of the Sahel, and for not just the Sahel, actually, large parts of Africa. And then most recently, the situation in the Sudan, where again, the contention between the emerging big powers, particularly the Gulf powers, but also others, again, is creating untold misery amongst the inhabitants of the Sudan. But of course, we shouldn't forget that in this new scramble, perhaps the major contention is probably between the US and China, and carried out by a variety of means. And the other thing I think to bear in mind about the new scramble is just refer back to the old scramble. So the old scramble not only led to the division and partition of the African continent, but also led to the First World War. And so this contention between the big powers in Africa not only has immediate consequences, but may have even more devastating consequences in the future. So this is another of these legacies. And then lastly, the last legacy I just wanted to mention in passing is the legacy of Eurocentrism in its many forms. And one of those forms is the kind of thinking which cannot be that there are alternatives. As one of the problems with Eurocentrism is it promotes the view there's only one way of doing things. There's only one economic system, there's only one political system, and so on. And that's probably the most dangerous legacy, although Eurocentrism manifests itself in so many ways in the continent as well as in the diaspora too. So on that note, I will conclude, and thank you for your attention.
Morning, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. We're going to do the normal dancer routine that we did yesterday or so to get you guys in the mood, or might do a little something in a little bit of time. But thank you so much for attending today. Really grateful to you. And we're really grateful to Professor Hakim Adi. Professor Adi, thank you so much. Whereabouts in the world are you, Professor Adi?
I'm in the Caribbean.
In a broad area. Are you hiding, or are you hiding, or are you going to be specific with us? So you're in exile or something?
No, I'm not in exile. I'm at a writing retreat, you could say, for the winter.
That's the man who's landed himself a nice little book deal. So there we go. Congratulations.
Yeah. I'm actually writing a history of Africa.
Oh well, amazing. I've actually counted at least 50 copies sold for you over here in this room right now. So congratulations. Right. Professor Adi, I'm going to start with a very, very controversial question. First of all, let's compliment your lecture. And I think it was absolutely profound. It really cut through, built upon a lot of what we had the opportunity to learn and discuss yesterday. Going to start with a very provocative question, and it's one that you're probably going to hunt me down for when you get back to London. And I'll be ready with my stab bulletproof vest for when you show me. Did Berlin do us any favors as African people?
No.
Fair enough. It's consistent with the answer received yesterday, which is totally fine. Let's talk a little bit about the Cairo Declaration, which I don't think we touched on too much yesterday. The Cairo Declaration, which suggests that the borders permeating from Berlin would be respected in order to actually alleviate, or in order to prevent in order to prevent intracontinental fighting and or regional fighting, or so, civil war, so on and so forth. With the benefit of hindsight, do you believe that that was an error, or was there a better way of actually organising things at that moment, given the nature of the opportunity that we probably won't see again for a while to come?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is that the borders haven't been completely respected, if that's the right word, because there have been discussions and contentions and differences about borders. And obviously some new states have been created in that period. So we have today South Sudan that didn't exist then. We have Eritrea that didn't exist then. And we've had not hundreds, but certainly numerous of border disputes during that period. So it's not as if there hasn't been any change. If if we time travel back to 1963, 1964, could other things have been done? Sure. I mean, we could have a United States of Africa. That path could have been followed, and then those borders would not, the existing borders in which I can't remember what it is. I think it's about 60% of Africans are actually divided in terms of African nation. I don't mean polities, I mean nations. In other words, nations that are divided between two states or more than two states. I think that's living countries of that.
You mean like say Yoruba people?
Yeah, exactly.
Nigeria.
So if you had a United States of Africa, some of those problems would have diminished. Then there might be all sorts of other problems. But I think if you look at the agendas of some of those early conferences, as I said, about what the key issues facing the continent were at that time, was the right decision made? Well, maybe it was, because the settler colonialism as existed in 1963 doesn't exist anymore. As a consequence, there was that unity of Africa, and that was the great contribution of the OAU, that it contributed to the end of the apartheid regime in South Africa, in Namibia, in Mozambique, and Angola, and so on and so forth. So from that point of view, you could say that things worked out favorably, but the issue still exists. That the issue still exists to be resolved in certain ways. Again, you could argue that the African continent faces other serious problems today, which also require attention. So I think it's definitely still an issue that needs to be resolved. But whether, as I say, apart from the proposals that Nkrumah and others were making at that time, whether there were other possibilities, I'm not sure what those other possibilities were.
I'll just ask a bit. So, Professor Adi mentioned one of the ideas could have been sort of the creation of a United States of Africa. Just posing into the room, is there anybody who would object to that as an idea, as a good idea? I'm not going to go to you, Delio, because we know you're allergic to Pan-Africanism. So can we just get a couple of ideas as to why? Why do you object to that idea?
I think the concept of African unity, Pan-Africanism, as a response to European colonialism makes a lot of sense. I don't think it's the answer. I think that leaning into this idea that all Black people, all African people are the same is not the solution.
But do they need to be the same?
What, to form a functioning United States?
Absolutely. Europeans are the same. The French, the Belgians, and whoever else is
So are we talking about the United States of Africa like the EU, which I think works a bit better than the US, but still has its problems?
Even if you go to America, for example, the people of Birmingham, Alabama, the people of New York, the people of Los Angeles, the people of Atlanta, so Atlanta is very different to Miami, and they're not that far away.
And I don't think that sums up the serious problems, actually, that are in the US right now. Californians don't feel like their votes mean anything.
But America is the most successful country that we can possibly
by a few definitions, but not all.
What definition would it not be most successful?
If you are white, it's pretty good. For example,
if you're Black, by the most successful group of Black people on earth are probably African Americans. But I want to ask Professor Adi that. I want to put the questions. I'll come to you in a moment, Uncle.
Yeah.
But I want to ask Professor Adi that. Professor Adi, pop in the balloon of Eurocentricity, because as you and I both know, the idea of the United States of Africa is often lampooned or so as a Gaddafiite or a Mugabe-ish idea in which is somewhat ridiculous. Do you view it as something that would have benefited Africans more than the current status quo permeating from Cairo Declaration, probably prior to that?
Yeah, well, I always go back to the Manchester Pan-African Congress for my perspective on these things. And I mentioned that there were three key considerations there. One was borders, one were political, the other was political institutions, and the third was a capital-centered economic system. So perhaps the key ingredient in all that is political institutions. So what is the decision-making process? So the key thing about the borders, or one of the key things about borders, is that Africans have never decided on these borders. And so to change that situation, one has to develop a decision-making process which involves the entire continent. And that decision-making process, which involves the whole continent, has not yet been developed. In fact, it doesn't even exist in individual states.
Well, why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's because, to put it simply, I think those who we should say are in power in the existing African states have a vested interest in keeping things the way they are, and so the decision-making process hasn't been changed. But it's a decision-making process that doesn't work in the US and doesn't work in Britain. So how is it going to work in Africa? It definitely needs to be changed. And particularly in the 21st century, it definitely needs to be changed. And we have 500,000 years at least of African political institutions and African decision-making mechanisms, often involving consensus. And certainly the African continent needs to adopt African institutions of the 21st century, which involve everybody in the decision-making process.
Sorry, I just want to be clear. I'm not picking on you. This is good. We're a bit more combative today, or so in terms of my question. Okay, so it's good. Okay. So
I would follow up just by saying that your definitions of success are actually rooted in this idea of capital as well. So we're still operating on the Eurocentric definitions that there's only one way to do things.
I think you're right. I think you're 100% right. And I think part of what we're trying to do today is to pop that movement, to really understand what a different concept would look like. So I do a lot of television work, and I'm not on TV with Kwasi Kwarteng, who I was trying to get to come here today, but he doesn't have the balls. But what ended up playing Kwasi. But the funny thing about it, whenever I come up with an alternative model or something, he just dismisses me as a Marxist. And it's something that I often just review as that Eurocentric simplicity. But we're all subject to it, and the idea for all of us coming together is part of that in relation to it. Let's go to we saw some hands. Uncle, please. You'll continue.
I'm just trying to react to what he said.
React away. Never have it. Our barrels.
The people of Africa are varied and things like that. But I come to the last time I checked, and then China is 1.7 billion people.
Yes, absolutely.
Whereas, and they have one president, one central government. And Africa is 1 billion minus plus. India is 1.4 billion.
Correct.
We have one prime minister, one system of government. And I see no reason why that cannot work for Africa. When you just talk about the people, the population,
Uncle,
and then
would you be willing to live under an African dictatorship?
You said?
Would you be willing to live under a dictator, a strong man in the African continent?
It is progressive. Africa needs a progressive dictator.
Both those countries use
to move forward rather than.
Who would be your ideal African progressive dictator?
Well, we have one at the moment.
Such as who? You gonna say Paul Kagame?
No, Traoré.
Ibrahim Traoré.
Yeah.
Interesting. Fair enough. Very good perspective. Well, let's go to Dalil quickly.
Yes, Professor Adi, thank you very much for that presentation. My question is this. The Europeans, we know, met over a period of 4 months to determine those borders. In fact, the deliberations started before November, and they rose in February. I'm curious to understand how long did our people, the Africans, who came to this OAU Cairo Declaration, how long did they deliberate over this issue in arriving at the decision to preserve those borders? I really, if you could give any indication on that, and if they had any minutes of their discussions that we could consider, so we could see what issues entered their heads when they came to this crazy conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's true to say that people sat down in Berlin and discussed borders. I don't think that's accurate. I mean, the borders between these European colonies were being, you could say, discussed and fought over for years, for decades, in fact, both before the Berlin Conference and after it. And as I said at the beginning, the main aim of the Berlin Conference was to try to remove some of the contention between the big powers and to establish guidelines as to how the continent could be divided. And the means which, or the expression which they came up with, was the idea of effective occupation, which essentially meant military conquest, and that military conquest took decades to carry out in Africa. I think with the discussions, I could ask the same question: how long did people take to discuss whether they should be United States of Africa? These discussions took place over a couple of years, particularly in the early stages of the OAU. There are some minutes, I think, of some of those meetings place at other conferences, but they took place in the context of the discussions that were going on about lots of other things. And one of those was the question of African unity. African unity was probably the key discussion that took place at that time, at the founding of the OAU, and even before it, and certainly after it. The unity of Africa to end colonialism in all its forms, or colonialism in all its open, formal forms. And as I said, if you look at the Cairo meeting in particular and that agenda, the main discussions were about South Africa, were about the Portuguese colonies, and so on and so forth. So, but I mean, these discussions and arguments about borders have continued and go on to this day. There are still border disputes in African countries. So it's not that the matter has been resolved. It clearly hasn't been resolved. All I was trying to do was put it into the context of what was being discussed at the time, and making the point that was African unity achieved of a certain type to enable the main challenges of that time to be realized. As I say, those were ending settler colonialism. I'd also just like to make, to re-emphasize two other things, a point that I made before about United States of Africa. The issue of United States of Africa, again, also raises the question of what kind of United States, what kind of political system is going to exist within that United States of Africa. And again, that's a whole massive discussion. Again, it needs to include the question of who has the decision-making power in that United States of Africa, or who has a decision-making power in any state in Africa. And that is an even bigger discussion, you could say, than the question of borders, and certainly hasn't been resolved really within any African country. And even where it is resolved, the big powers intervene and destroy those systems which don't conform to their Eurocentrism. And that's what's happened in Libya, to give one example. So that's an issue that has to be resolved. Where does decision-making power reside? Does it reside with a handful of people, or does it reside with the majority of people? And then the second question related to that is, what kind of economic system should exist in Africa or in African countries? Is it going to be a capital-centered system, or is it going to be a people-centered system? And those are also very, very big discussions that will probably only be resolved by the people of Africa taking these things into their own hands and deciding them.
Professor Andy, can I it's now so if you can see me also, but just going to ask a couple of questions in relation to what you just stated over there, and I'll follow on from what I said to one earlier on. In fact, I'll say it to you too. Putting it back into your hands, looking at, say, if there was, say, some form of popping the balloon of Eurocentricity, if there was some form of United States of Africa, or were to make that move towards that, what do you think would be the ideal mechanism of leadership and economic model?
Well, I mean, that's easy. The economic model would be one in which the people are at the center. So that would mean that everything would be done in the interests of the majority of people. So it would mean, for example, that you would have, you'd have water. You'd have clean water. You'd have a health system. It's interesting that in the countries in Africa, which are the wealthiest, those who are in power, when they get ill, they don't stay in those countries. They go to Britain, they go to France, they go to the US for their healthcare. So you'd have healthcare, you'd have water, you'd have an education system, which would be free and so on. Just to start with, you develop the food producing capacities of those countries. You'd have a system which catered to the needs of the majority of people in those countries. And one could go on and talk about exactly what that would mean. It would mean the opposite, generally speaking, of what exists now. But the second thing, which is related to that, is that people have to be involved in making decisions about what kind of economic system, what kind of political system, what it is that they need, what it is that they want. And at the moment, we have Eurocentric political systems which don't allow decision-making power to those systems very well, because those who live in Britain and so on live in that system. We don't make decisions about anything. So that has to end in Africa. So these two things, a people-centered economic system and people-centered decision-making system, have to be at the center of things in order that Africa is transformed. And if you had a United States of Africa, which had those characteristics, then definitely I would be greatly in favor of it. The problem that we have at the moment with the various developments which are taking place with the AU mean that it will become probably an economic system in Africa which favors the big powers, just like the EU favors the big powers in Europe. It doesn't even favor the whole of Europe. It favors the big powers and the big countries in Europe, and is essentially against the interests of the majority of people in Europe. So we have to be very careful about these things. And the key ingredient is who makes the decisions and in whose interests are those decisions made. And as long as it is within a system in which the majority of people don't have decision-making power, then it will not be in their interests.
And so if there's a sure-shot way of becoming really popular on the internet as an African, as a Black person in particular, which is to suggest a couple of talking points. One, that it wasn't colonialism had no effect on Africa, so it was socialist policies of post colonial presidents and leaders and so on and so forth. Another one is to just blame everything on Black people. But some of the people who do come up to them, there's one gentleman who I saw, who normally shared a platform with PLO Lumumba, who I do hold in extremely high esteem. I think he's actually one of our best thinkers and speakers in modern times. I can't remember the other gentleman's name. But he suggested the other day, that kind of shocked me, so I'll put it to you, Professor Adi. He said that Africans can't afford democracy right now.
Joshua.
That was who? Joshua
Tango or something.
I don't know his name, so yeah. Africans can't afford democracy right now. So democracy won't work back then. He pretty much, as Uncle suggested, a Ibrahim Traore style strongman. So I wonder what your perspective on that would be.
Well, history shows that it doesn't work. I mean, that's the problem with it, that one has to have both an economic and, particularly in the 21st century, an economic and political system which is people-centered, in order to avoid all the problems which essentially Eurocentric systems bring. But they don't just bring them to Africa. Those problems exist in all parts of the world, because there are a whole variety of other related problems, environmental problems, for example, problems of education, problems of culture. What kind of culture do you have in a country, and so on? Whose interest does it serve? So there are a whole lot of related problems. But you see, this is a very dictatorial view, isn't it? The people are not ready. Who is he? Whoever he is. I have never heard of him. Whoever he is, who is he to decide what Africans are ready for? Africans should decide what Africans are ready for. That's the issue. And if people may well make mistakes when they have decision-making powers, because you also need to create the conditions for people to make informed decisions about everything. And that also has to be established in any decision-making. But if we're in this room and we want to decide what we're going to have for lunch, let's say, just to take, well, we can discuss what we want to have this. Why should that be decided by one person? And all these decisions which concern our futures, which concern our interests, we should be the decision makers about. This is the principle. This is a 21st century. We're all literate, we're all educated, we're all perfectly capable of making decisions about our lives. But we live in political systems which don't allow us to make those decisions. And that has to change. If it doesn't change, then we are faced with very serious problems. The problems of war, the problems of environmental devastation, all of these problems which exist in the world and which exist in Africa. I mean, in Africa, where you have such great poverty, where we have wars, where we have the inability of people to have clean drinking water, the inability of people to have electricity, the inability. These are very basic things. And it's also a question of what we consider to be human rights in the 21st century, because to have these things are basic human rights, things which humans need in order to exist. And in order to get them, we have to have decision-making powers. Determining our futures is also a human right, which is being denied to us. And the fact that these things are denied are themselves crimes against humans, crimes against humanity. And as I started by saying, that's what colonialism was and is. And the sooner we start to think of it in those terms and think of our existence in those terms, maybe the sooner we'll be in a position to transform things and have the kind of political systems, the kind of economic systems, the kind of societies that we want, because we will be the decision makers.
We've got some more questions here, so I'll go to gentlemen at the back, and then we'll come to you, then we'll come to you. Please.
Thank you, Prof. Adi, for for the lecture and the thoughts you've raised here. Now, as I listen to you and I listen to some of the questions and comments, education comes back to me. What education do we have? We say we are all educated, lots of people are educated, but on the African continent, what education do we have? And I'll illustrate that with an example. I schooled in Nigeria in primary 4. I had an exam to take, and the question I was asked was, who discovered River Niger? If I wrote anything but Mungo Park, I would fail that exam. Now, if you think about it, what is it telling me about how I think about solutions and everything else? It comes from outside rather than from Africans. I've spoken to colleagues who went to university. I asked them the question, what principle, what theory, what did you learn whilst you're in university that was African? And none of them, from medical doctors to engineers to psychologists, none of them can tell me one. And my question is, if the education and the way we think is crucial, what do we need to start doing now with the young and with the old to begin to build the basis to take these decisions that are crucial.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. And that's the point I was making about Eurocentrism and exactly how it operates. And that's just one example, but it's a good example. So the way people are educated is essentially a Eurocentric manner. And so that definitely restricts the way that we think about everything, the way that we make decisions about everything. And of course, that has to stop. Not just in history, it's perhaps particularly acute in history. And the other thing about Africa is a lot of people don't even learn any history.
Yes, that's very true.
Because history is hardly taught in Africa or in the Caribbean, for that matter. It's hardly taught, and it's only taught to a certain age, and it's still very Eurocentric and so on. So these things have to change, and again, it comes down to who is making the decisions. In fact, I just came from a conference in Algeria where there were some government ministers complaining about their education system. And you couldn't believe it, but they're the ones that are making decisions. And they're saying we have Eurocentric education system. So yes, these things have to change but we have even more basic problems. I mean, in Nigeria, we have one of the highest levels of adult illiteracy and so on. So there are very basic problems in terms of education in the continent. Just to have literacy, not adult literacy, but literacy and numeracy in general, as well as all these other aspects of learning about the traditions of Africa, its political systems, its economic systems, its environmental systems, everything. People learning from the past and learning from the best of the past and not despising their own history, their own culture, and so on, in such a way that people have confidence to make decisions about their futures. And that involves, as I say, decisions about health, about education, about environment, about all kinds of things, which people are prevented from taking. And those decisions are often made in the interests of the big multinationals, for example. I mean, in Nigeria, I mean, there's an obvious example of Ogoni land, just to give that particular example, where the government of the big oil companies and not in the interests of the people who live in the area or live in the Niger Delta in general. So how can that be the case? How is that possible in the 21st century? So we have to turn all these things around, and they're all interconnected. Economic system, political system, education system, environment, all of these things are interconnected and are a legacy of colonialism, a legacy of what was imposed on Africa. And the people of Africa have never had the opportunity to decide, well, we want something very different. And where people have been given that opportunity, then it's very clear what people's preferences are. They want something different from what exists today. And the thing which is needed is for them to have that decision-making power and be able to, piece by piece, be able to transform things. I think somebody mentioned Ibrahim Traore and what's going on in Burkina Faso a few moments ago and elsewhere. And one can see, even with that limitations of that system, the reforms that have been undertaken there, or some of those reforms that have been undertaken, how simple they are, and yet they're in the interest of the country. And yet those countries around, just in West Africa, can't take similar measures which are in the interest of the country, which are patriotic, which are to some extent in the interest of their people. These decisions cannot be taken, and doesn't that expose the uselessness of the economic and political systems which exist in the ECOWAS countries and those who are governing them, and that a change needs to be made in the political and economic systems in those countries, which can only be undertaken by people themselves finding ways to change these systems so that they have political, economic, environmental, and education systems which favor them and which favor their interests.
Yeah, perhaps the most serious act of Eurocentricity we can think of in recent times, probably Tinubu's government actually bombing right inside Lagos. I'll just go to gentleman in the middle because we heard from you quite a bit yesterday. We haven't heard from gentleman in the middle yet. So let's see if we've got something upstairs.
Okay. I'll try and come up with something original. Hello everyone. My name is Alan Harding. I rather controversially am an economist. I am based in Oxford. I've got links with the Centre for the Study of African Economies, Oxford Department of International Development. I'm also a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, which is possibly something controversial. But I would encourage, if you haven't been to the Royal Geographical Society, it's really worth going there because their archive is full of the tangible objects that were around at the time of the scramble of Africa. You know, some of those, you want to go see David Livingstone's boots, they're there. You want to go and see some of these documents, they're there. So there's an amazing archive there that's worth exploring. Anyway, just on this question about sort of integration and unity, I just want to make the basic point that it seems to me that if you have a discussion about the cost benefits of integration, unity, I would encourage people to distinguish between the economics of closer African unity and integration and the politics of it. So as an economist, I think that things like this Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement that's kind of going through seems to me to be a good thing. I mean, and in a number of Latin countries, the benefits of economies integrating, of facilitating movement of people, facilitating movement of goods, cutting the costs, making it easier to go across borders, all that kind of stuff, which is obviously something that we in the UK have decided to go in the opposite direction. But there we go. So I would say if you get, it's an interesting discussion, I think, about can you have closer African economic integration without political integration? Do those two things have to go together? Can you have one without the other? How do you sequence them? That's more a statement than a question, but I'd be interested to hear what our colleague there sort of thinks about that.
Professor Adi, did you hear that?
I would say two things. Firstly, I always come back to the question of who decides. Who decides these are good things? When I hear the word free or the two words free trade, I sort of immediately am concerned. And I think if you take the example of the EU, who benefits from the EU? If the EU is a free trade area, and that's anyway, whether it is, it isn't. But if one is thinking of that kind of thing, who benefits from that? The big multinational companies, the big banks are those who benefit from that. And if we have an African free trade area, the same is likely to happen. The person on the ground is unlikely, in my view, and looking at history, to benefit greatly from that. Yes, of course, there'll be some economies for those who are importing and exporting and so on. But for the person on the ground, the ordinary worker, the ordinary farmer, I doubt whether they will benefit greatly from it. Just as the average citizen in the EU doesn't benefit greatly from living in the EU. The EU benefits the big multinationals. It not only benefits them within Europe, but also because of its relationship with Africa.
Professor Adi, can I just ask you about it? So you take, for example, you look at the West African coastline, right? You have, if we go, say, Togo, Benin, Nigeria, Cameroon, all beside each other. Nigeria is a massive oil-rich nation. If the oil price spikes, effectively what happens is that Nigeria gets a lot of oil money, but then Nigerian currency, of course, appreciates, which makes it harder, which makes Nigerian exports a lot more, Nigerian exports or Nigerian produce, Nigerian agricultural produce, a lot more expensive to actually put on the market. But it makes imports from Benin and Togo and other places in Cameroon, which are actually all normally the same products, cheaper in Nigeria, and decimates the agricultural system. So it decimates the local agricultural system, and empowers, say, Benin, Ghana, or those other people who are not oil economies beside them. So I'm just thinking of that really ground down elements of how the economies work. So the more we could remove, say, the borders to trade, and of course the borders to physical movement, because it's stupid that Africans have to get visas to travel within Africa. And sure, that has to be a benefit to the average person on the ground.
Well, you see, the problem is that the economies don't work like that. Let's take Nigeria as an example. So Nigeria has been a major oil producer throughout the period of its formal independence. It's the biggest or second biggest economy in Africa. But as a major fuel producer, it can't produce electricity for its population. It can't even produce kerosene for its population. So the fact that you have a large economy, or you even have these important minerals or oil wealth, doesn't mean that wealth is shared between the population of that country. So if you have to look at economics in terms of the majority of people. Are the majority of people going to benefit? And my estimation is, based on the history of Nigeria and the way that the economy of Nigeria works, no, they will not benefit. Nigeria has some of the largest rivers in the world, but it can't produce clean drinking water for its population. This is the second biggest, most prosperous economy in Africa. People don't have clean water to drink. So it's not a question of the size of the economy or the potential wealth of the economy. It's a question of in whose interest does the economy operate? Does it operate in the interest of the few, or does it operate in the interest of the many? So as long as it operates in the interest of a few, any changes in terms of its integration with surrounding economies, or even its integration continentally, in my estimation, are not likely to benefit the majority of people in Nigeria. We have these arguments before about the consequences of neoliberalism, which is essentially what this is about. That neoliberalism is good for everybody, that wealth will trickle down to everybody, and so on, and that it will trickle down in Africa. But generally speaking, it doesn't trickle. It may trickle down, but it trickles down extremely. Do not benefit from those. In fact, there's just been a report that's come out about inequality in the world. And what does it tell us? That inequality is growing, that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, not only within countries, but also between geographical areas in the world. So these kinds of changes that are being discussed now, without the fundamental changes I'm talking about, and without people being involved in the decision making, in my estimation, are not likely to change things very much in the interest of the majority of people.
Professor Hakim Adi, thank you so much for your time. A round of applause for us.
Thanks. I don't know whether there was a round of applause, so I didn't hear it.
Oh, do another round of applause.
You might have turned off the speaker. I don't know what happened then, but I'll accept that there was one, even if it was a very small one. It's fine.
Well, anyway, look, we know that you are somewhere in the Caribbean, under nice air conditioned, very, very colonial looking room, a little bit with the lampshade over there. So enjoying your 6-figure deal, and we congratulate you on that. But we look forward to seeing you in the UK this time.
Yeah, the 6 figures come after the decimal points.
Congratulations, and we'll speak to you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. See you.
See you.